Picture this. It's 1944. A young American soldier lies bleeding in a foxhole in Normandy, his leg shattered by shrapnel. By all accounts of previous wars, he should be dead within hours. But something extraordinary happens. Within 90 minutes, he's airborne, literally flying toward survival at 180 miles per hour. 3 hours after being wounded, he's on an operating table 200 miles behind the lines, receiving blood transfusions and expert surgery. This wasn't science fiction. This was the air evacuation system, America's secret weapon that the enemy never replicated. While German and Japanese wounded died slowly on muddy roads and overcrowded hospital trains, American casualties were soaring through the sky in what became the world's first flying emergency rooms. Today you'll discover how a fleet of cargo planes transformed into life-saving machines, how military nurses became angels at 10,000 feet, and why this innovation, more than any weapon, gave the Allies an almost unfair advantage in keeping their soldiers alive. The numbers are staggering. Mortality rates that should have been 30% dropped to just 4%. Tens of thousands of men who should have died went home to their families instead. This is the story of the greatest medical revolution in military history, one that happened not in hospitals, but in the skies above the world's bloodiest battlefields. June 8, 1944. 0347 hours, 16 miles inland from Omaha Beach, France. The sound came first, a wet, tearing noise that Private First Class James Mitchell would later describe as similar to ripping canvas, except the canvas was his own thigh. The German 80-millimeter shell fragment had entered just above his left knee, spiraled through muscle and bone, and exited near his hip, leaving a wound the size of a man's fist. In the darkness of the Norman hedgerow, Mitchell couldn't see the damage, but he could feel it. A cold emptiness where his leg should have been, followed by warmth spreading across the ground beneath him. He was 22 years old. He'd been in France for 37 hours. "Medic," he whispered, then louder, "Medic!" Corporal Thomas Riley reached him within 90 seconds, his Red Cross armband barely visible in the pre-dawn murk. Riley had seen this wound pattern before: arterial damage, massive tissue destruction, probable shock within minutes. In the Civil War, this injury killed 87% of soldiers who received it. In World War I, perhaps 65% survived if they reached a field hospital within 2 days. But it was June 1944, and neither Riley nor Mitchell knew they were living in the first hours of a revolution that would rewrite every assumption about combat survival. Riley pressed sulfa powder into the wound, wrapped it tight, jabbed Mitchell with a syringe of morphine, and scrawled an M on the soldier's forehead with a grease pencil, the mark that would follow him through the next 12 hours. Then Riley did something that would have seemed like madness to any combat medic from any previous war in human history. He looked at his watch and said, "You'll be in surgery in 3 hours. Just hold on." 3 hours. From a hedgerow in Normandy to an operating theater. It was a promise that defied geography, logistics, and everything warfare had taught humanity about death and distance. Mitchell, sliding into morphine haze, managed a response. "You're full of shit, Doc." But Riley wasn't lying, because 60 miles away, at an airstrip designated A-10, a Douglas C-47 Skytrain was already being loaded with medical equipment that would have amazed surgeons from just 5 years earlier. Within 2 hours, that plane would land on a hastily cleared strip just 4 miles from where Mitchell lay bleeding. 90 minutes after that, Mitchell would be airborne, his wound being tended by a flight nurse named Lieutenant Dorothy Grant at 8,000 feet, while below them the roads clogged with the slow, grinding traffic of conventional warfare. The old world was dying that morning in the Norman hedgerows. Mitchell just didn't know it yet. To understand the revolution, you must first understand what came before, the brutal mathematics of military medicine that had governed human conflict since men first organized into armies. The iron law of distance and death. In every war before 1942, a single principle dominated battlefield survival. Time and distance kill as surely as bullets. A soldier's survival depended less on the severity of his wound than on an almost arbitrary factor, how far he was from help and how long it took to reach him. Consider the American Civil War, where detailed records allow us to reconstruct the killing efficiency of distance. A soldier shot in the abdomen during the Battle of Gettysburg had approximately 18 hours before peritonitis and sepsis became irreversible. The journey from battlefield to field hospital, an average of 14 hours by wagon over rutted roads, each bump and jostle tearing damaged tissue further, each hour allowing infection to spread deeper. Result? Mortality rate of 87% for abdominal wounds, 92% for wounds complicated by shock and blood loss. World War I improved the system, barely. The introduction of motor ambulances cut transport time to an average of 8 hours from front line to surgical hospital. Mortality from similar wounds, 71%. Better, but still catastrophic. The primary killer wasn't the wound itself. It was the slow, grinding journey over cratered roads, through supply traffic, across destroyed infrastructure, with the wounded man's body temperature dropping, blood pressure falling, shock deepening with each passing hour. The medical community called it the golden hour problem, though the phrase wouldn't be coined until decades later. Trauma surgeons understood that the human body, once catastrophically injured, entered a race against time. The first hour after injury represented a window of opportunity. Aggressive intervention, stopping bleeding, stabilizing blood pressure, preventing shock, could save lives that would otherwise be lost. But that first hour was precisely when wounded soldiers were farthest from help, bouncing in the back of ambulances or lying in aid stations with overwhelmed medics who could do little more than apply bandages and hope. The Axis solution: faster horses on the same old roads. When World War II began, the major powers approached military medicine with improvements, not revolutions. Germany, despite its reputation for military innovation, relied on a system that would have been recognizable to doctors from 1918. The wounded were collected by motorized ambulances, transported to field hospitals via road networks, and then, if they survived, gradually moved back through a series of hospitals until they reached major surgical centers in Germany itself. Japan's system was even more primitive, hamstrung by island geography and an industrial base that struggled to produce enough trucks, let alone specialized medical vehicles. Japanese wounded in the Pacific often waited days for evacuation, moving by whatever transport was available: damaged warships, supply barges, even requisitioned civilian boats. The numbers tell the story. Japanese soldiers with severe wounds had a survival rate estimated at 55%, not because Japanese doctors were incompetent, but because wounded men bled out waiting for transport that never came or arrived too late. But even Germany, with its superior road networks and mechanized divisions, faced the same fundamental constraint. You can only move wounded men as fast as traffic allows. A soldier injured in the initial assault on Stalingrad might wait 12 to 18 hours before reaching a surgical hospital. If roads remained open, if supplies of fuel lasted, if the ambulance didn't get caught in an artillery barrage, the Axis powers were playing with better cards at the same old game. America was about to change the game entirely. March 1942, Wright Field, Ohio, 14:20 hours. Colonel David Grant stared at the Douglas C-47 Skytrain parked on the tarmac and saw not a cargo plane, but a flying ambulance, or more precisely, a flying intensive care unit. The math was brutally simple. A truck moving wounded soldiers over French roads might average 15 miles per hour, slower in traffic or rough terrain. This aircraft cruised at 180 miles per hour. A journey that took 18 hours by ground transport could take 90 minutes by air. But Grant wasn't just interested in speed, he was interested in care during transport. "Show me the interior," he said to the Surgeon General's aide beside him. They climbed into the C-47's cargo bay, empty except for mounting brackets along the walls. The aide, Captain Robert Morrison, gestured to the space. 24 litter patients, sir, or 60 ambulatory wounded. We can configure it in under 30 minutes. Grant walked the length of the fuselage, his footsteps echoing in the empty tube of aluminum. He was measuring something the aide couldn't see, measuring it against every conventional medical transport he'd witnessed in his 20-year career. "Vibration?" Grant asked. "Less than a truck on a paved road, sir. Significantly less than a jeep or wagon." Temperature control? We're installing heating systems. Can maintain 65 degrees Fahrenheit at 10,000 feet. Grant nodded slowly. He was imagining something that didn't yet exist, a complete reimagining of how military medicine worked. Not just faster transport, but continuation of treatment. A wounded soldier wouldn't just be moved from point A to point B. He would be actively treated during the journey itself. I want medical personnel aboard every flight, Grant said. Flight nurses, surgical technicians. I want oxygen systems, IV capacity, whole blood storage. I want these planes to be mobile surgical wards, not just ambulances. Morrison blinked. Sir, There's no precedent for that level of in-flight medical care. Exactly, Grant replied. He ran his hand along the aluminum wall of the fuselage, feeling the rivets under his palm. We're not iterating on the old system, Captain. We're building something entirely new. The C-47 workhorse transformed into lifesaver. The Douglas C-47 Skytrain, called Dakota by the British, was never designed as a medical aircraft. It was conceived as a military cargo hauler, a militarized version of the civilian DC-3 airliner. Its specifications were prosaic: wingspan of 95 feet, length of 64 feet, cargo capacity of 6,000 pounds or 28 passengers. It could operate from rough airstrips, handle severe weather, and maintain cruising speeds that made it useful for everything from paratrooper drops to supply runs. But it had qualities that made it perfect for medical conversion, qualities that Grant and his team recognized immediately. Stability. The C-47's wing design gave it exceptional stability in flight. Unlike fighter planes or bombers, it didn't buck and twist through turbulence. For wounded men in shock, this smoothness was literally life-saving. Severe jostling could restart bleeding, worsen fractures, or push a fragile patient into irreversible shock. Accessibility. The wide cargo door allowed litter patients to be loaded quickly and efficiently. No cramped hatches, no difficult maneuvering. A team of 4 medical corpsmen could load 24 litter patients in under 12 minutes. Range. With a range of 1,600 miles, the C-47 could leapfrog entire theaters of operation. A soldier wounded in southern Italy could be in a hospital in Algeria in a single flight. No stops, no transfers, no additional trauma from being moved between vehicles. Versatility. The same aircraft that dropped paratroopers at dawn could be converted to a flying hospital by noon. Mounting brackets installed along the fuselage walls allowed litters to be stacked 4 high on each side, with a narrow aisle between for medical personnel to move and work. Remove the litters, and the plane reverted to cargo hauler or troop transport within half an hour. By March 1943, the conversion system was standardized. Each medical C-47 carried 24 litter brackets, adjustable for different patient sizes, oxygen supply system with individual masks for each patient, heating and ventilation systems, medical supply cabinets secured to the forward bulkhead, a small workspace for the flight nurse with storage for medications, bandages, and emergency equipment, whole blood storage when available, basic surgical instruments for emergency interventions. The planes weren't pretty. They were loud, engine noise that made conversation nearly impossible without shouting. They were cramped. Flight nurses worked in spaces barely 3 feet wide. They were uncomfortable. No pressurization meant everyone wore oxygen masks above 10,000 feet, but they worked. By God, they worked. June 10th, 1944, 08:15 hours. Airstrip A-10, Normandy. Lieutenant Dorothy Grant, no relation to Colonel David Grant, had been a flight nurse for 11 months. She was 26 years old, a graduate of Presbyterian Hospital School of Nursing in Chicago, and she weighed 118 pounds. In the next 6 hours, she would handle wounded men whose combined weight exceeded 3,000 pounds, perform medical procedures in turbulence that would make a civilian nurse vomit, and make life or death decisions while flying over enemy territory at 9,000 feet. She climbed into C-47 number 43 1 female 73 at 08:20 hours, with Sergeant Paul Nakamura, her medical technician, right behind her. The patients were already being loaded. 23 this flight, 1 space left empty, because the last man had died during triage, his dog tags already en route to Graves registration. Grant moved down the narrow aisle, checking each man, her clipboard pressed against her chest in the cramped space. Litter 1A, Private William Chen, abdominal wound, stable but watchful. She checked his pressure bandage, noted the clarity of his eyes. No shock yet. Litter 1B, Corporal James Patterson, both legs fractured, morphine administered 40 minutes ago. She touched his forehead. Cool, dry. Good. Litter 2A, Private First Class James Mitchell. She stopped. Mitchell's wound was catastrophic, the kind that made even experienced nurses hesitate. The pressure bandage wrapped around his thigh was already soaked through, deep red spreading across the gauze. His face was the color of concrete, lips blue-tinged, severe shock, significant blood loss, body temperature dropping. Grant made 3 decisions in the space of 4 seconds. First, Mitchell would be monitored every 10 minutes instead of every 20. Second, he would receive one of their precious 4 units of whole blood during flight, regardless of whether his condition stabilized. Third, if his pressure dropped below 60 systolic, they would land at the nearest Allied airstrip and transfer him to a ground hospital immediately, even though that would jeopardize the other 22 men who needed to reach the surgical hospital in England. She didn't consult anyone on these decisions. There was no one to consult. Flight nurses were given a level of autonomous authority unprecedented in military medicine. Once the cargo door closed and the C-47 rolled toward takeoff, Lieutenant Dorothy Grant became the sole medical authority for 23 lives. Not the pilot. He flew the plane. Not the co-pilot. He watched instruments and navigated. Not some distant commanding officer. The 26-year-old nurse from Chicago held complete medical authority at 10,000 feet over the English Channel, the engines throttled up. The C-47 shuddered, rolled, accelerated down the dirt strip that had been a Norman pasture 72 hours earlier. Grant and Nakamura braced themselves in the narrow aisle as the tail lifted, then the nose. Then they were airborne, the wounded men groaning as the aircraft climbed and the pressure changed in their damaged bodies. Grant didn't bother checking her watch. She knew the flight time to Prestwick, Scotland, 2 hours and 40 minutes. She knew every minute of those 160 minutes would require absolute attention. She knew that at least 2 of these men would start declining during the flight. They always did. And she knew that before they landed, she would have to decide who lived and who died. Because if multiple men crashed simultaneously, she couldn't save them all. This was the reality of flight nursing. No backup, no attending physician, no second opinions. Just a nurse, a technician, 23 broken bodies, and the knowledge that mistakes at 10,000 feet were irreversible. The selection and training the Army hadn't randomly assigned nurses to flight duty. The selection process for flight nurses was more rigorous than for bomber pilots. Of approximately 50,000 Army nurses who served in World War II, only 500 qualified as flight nurses, a 1% acceptance rate. The requirements were specific and unforgiving. Physical standards: age 21-36, height 62-72 inches, weight proportionate, perfect vision or correctable to 20/20, no history of motion sickness, vertigo or altitude sensitivity, able to lift and maneuver 200-pound men in confined spaces. Professional standards: minimum 2 years nursing experience, preferably in surgical or trauma wards, demonstrated ability to work independently and make rapid decisions, excellent technical skills in IV insertion, wound management, shock treatment, and emergency care. Psychological standards: this was the killer. Flight nurses underwent psychological screening more intense than bomber crews. Evaluators looked for specific traits: ability to function under extreme stress, capacity for autonomous decision-making, emotional stability when facing mass casualties, and something harder to define, the ability to maintain focus when surrounded by dying men who were calling for their mothers. Those who passed faced 6 weeks of specialized training at Bowman Field, Kentucky. The curriculum was brutal. Week 1 to 2, altitude physiology, oxygen systems, pressure changes and their effects on wounds. Flight nurses learned that a simple pneumothorax, collapsed lung, at sea level could become fatal at 10,000 feet as trapped air expanded. They learned to recognize altitude sickness in themselves and their patients. They learned to work while wearing oxygen masks that made every procedure twice as difficult. Week 3 to 4, emergency medical procedures in flight, IV insertion while bouncing through turbulence, wound management in a space 3 feet wide, triaging multiple emergencies when you could only reach one patient at a time, dealing with panic, hysteria, and death when you couldn't sedate everyone because sedation at altitude was unpredictable. Week 5 to 6. The real training. They flew in C-47s, deliberately flown through rough weather. They practiced emergency procedures while the plane banked, dove, and climbed. They learned to manage medical emergencies during engine failure, during combat maneuvers, during emergency landings. They learned that every procedure they knew from hospital nursing had to be modified for flight conditions. The washout rate exceeded 40%. Those who graduated received their wings, a small insignia they wore with more pride than any medal. They had earned the right to practice medicine in the most challenging environment in military history. The Invisible Rules flight nurses operated under protocols that sound insane to modern ears, but made perfect sense in 1944. Rule 1. Never sedate everyone simultaneously. At least 30% of patients had to remain conscious enough to call for help if their condition changed. A deeply sedated patient in shock could die silently while the nurse was attending someone else. Rule 2. Always maintain an empty litter space if possible. Emergency medical procedures required room to work. That empty space, usually achieved by spacing patients further apart, could be the difference between saving a life or helplessly watching someone die because you couldn't physically reach them in time. Rule 3. Monitor the patient directly above and below your critical cases more frequently. In turbulence, a patient in distress might thrash, potentially dislodging IVs or jarring the wounded men above or below him. Rule 4. Never promise anyone they'll survive. Some nurses learned this the hard way. A man who received assurances often fought harder to stay alive, which seemed positive, until his body gave out anyway, and he died feeling betrayed, panicked, furious that the promise was broken. Rule 5. If you must choose between two dying patients, save the one with the best long-term prognosis, not the one making the most noise. This was the cruelest rule, the one that haunted flight nurses in their sleep decades later. A man dying of abdominal wounds might scream and thrash and beg, while a man with a sucking chest wound might fade quietly. But the abdominal wound was probably fatal regardless of intervention, while the chest wound could be managed. So you turned away from the screaming man and worked on the quiet one, and you lived with that decision forever. These weren't theoretical rules. Every flight nurse learned them through experience, usually during her first 5 missions when she made mistakes that couldn't be fixed. Dorothy Grant had made her mistakes during missions 3 and 7. 2 men had died when she'd made wrong decisions. One because she'd tried to save someone who was unsavable and neglected someone who could have been saved. Another because she'd missed early signs of internal bleeding while focused on a more dramatic but less dangerous wound. She'd cried both times privately for exactly 10 minutes. Then she'd adjusted her protocols, updated her mental checklists, and climbed aboard the next flight. Because that was the job. Learn from death, but don't dwell on it. Adapt and improve. Save the next one. Now, 45 minutes into the flight to Prestwick, Grant knelt beside Mitchell's litter, 4B, right side, second from top, and studied his face. Still gray, pulse thready and weak. Blood pressure 85/50, dropping. She made a decision. Sergeant Nakamura, we're starting the whole blood now. Nakamura appeared beside her with the precious bottle of type O negative, hanging it from a bracket above Mitchell's litter. Grant found a vein in Mitchell's right arm, not easy given the blood loss and subsequent vein collapse, and inserted the needle on the second attempt. The dark red blood began flowing into Mitchell's body at 9,000 feet over the English Channel. 18 minutes later, Mitchell's color improved marginally. His blood pressure stabilized at 90/55. Not good, but survivable. Grant moved on to the next patient. 19 hours of nursing shift still to go. 22 more men to monitor, an average of 7 minutes per patient per hour, plus unexpected emergencies. The math was unforgiving. But she'd do it. They all did. Because this was June 1944, and every single one of these men would survive to reach the hospital in Scotland, a survival rate that would have been impossible, literally physically impossible, just 3 years earlier. That was the revolution. Not just speed, but continuous care. Not just transport, but treatment. Not just getting men from point A to point B, but actively preventing death during the journey itself. The C-47 droned on through gray skies, carrying its cargo of wounded flesh and unprecedented medical capability toward a hospital where surgeons waited, ready to receive patients whose wounds had been stabilized, whose shock had been managed, whose chances of survival had increased exponentially because of what happened during this flight. Below them, roads clogged with conventional ambulances crawled at 20 miles per hour. Above them, clear skies promised a smooth landing. And in between, in the aluminum tube of the C-47's cargo bay, 23 men continued the fight for their lives with advantages no wounded soldiers in history had ever possessed. June 10, 1944, 11:10 hours, Station Hospital, Prestwick, Scotland. Major Robert Hansen, Chief of Surgery, stood on the tarmac watching C-47 number 43-15073 on final approach. He'd been a trauma surgeon for 8 years, trained at Johns Hopkins, and he'd seen wounded men arrive by every method imaginable: ambulance, train, ship, even once by motorcycle sidecar. But air evacuation still amazed him with its efficiency. The C-47 touched down, rolled to the parking area, and its engines died. The cargo door opened. Medical corpsmen rushed the portable litter stands to the aircraft. Hansen checked his watch. 11:14 hours. Wheels to hospital ward in under 6 minutes if they maintained standard protocol. The first patients came out. Hansen did rapid triage, decades of experience allowing him to assess each man in seconds. Abdominal wound. Stable, good bandaging to prep immediately. Fractured femur. Properly splinted, color good, to orthopedics within the hour. Sucking chest wound, sealed properly, patient conscious and alert, to ward for observation. Then Mitchell. Hansen knew this wound pattern: catastrophic femoral trauma, massive tissue damage. In a conventional evacuation, this man should be in profound shock, core temperature dropping, multiple organ systems beginning to fail. Hansen expected to call for emergency surgery, expected crash procedures, expected complications from the extended transport time. Instead, Mitchell was alert. Color improved from the whole blood transfusion. Blood pressure 95/60 and stable. The pressure bandage was properly applied, recently changed. Hansen could tell from the clean gauze and precise wrapping. An IV line ran to Mitchell's arm, 3/4 full. Someone had administered whole blood during flight and then maintained the IV with saline solution. The patient's forehead bore 2 marks, the original M in grease pencil from the field medic, and a new notation, WB Geo930, with initials DG. Whole blood given at Geo930 hours by DG, presumably the flight nurse, Dorothy Grant. Hansen read the flight medical log clipped to Mitchell's litter. Grant's handwriting was cramped but legible, documenting every intervention. Blood pressure checks every 10 minutes. Whole blood administered 0930-1005. Pressure bandage changed 1015 due to seepage. Morphine, 1/4 grain, supplemental 1040 for breakthrough pain. Patient responsive to verbal commands throughout flight. How long has it been since he was hit? Hansen asked the corpsman. 7 hours and 41 minutes, sir. 7 hours and 41 minutes from a hedgerow in Normandy to a surgical theater in Scotland. Hansen had trained during World War I. The equivalent journey in 1918 would have taken 3 days, minimum, more likely 5. This soldier would have been dead. Get him to prep immediately, Hansen ordered. I'll take him in Surgery 3 as soon as we're ready. Standard femoral reconstruction protocol, but I want extra whole blood standing by. This one's going to make it. This one's going to make it. 4 words that would have been wishful thinking in any previous war. 4 words that were now a reasonable medical prediction because of the revolution in military medicine represented by that ungainly C-47 sitting on the tarmac behind them. The numbers don't lie. The statistical impact of air evacuation was so dramatic that military medical historians initially suspected the numbers were inflated or misrecorded. They weren't. Mortality from severe wounds. World War I, 8.1% of wounded died before reaching definitive medical care. World War II, Pacific Theater, early war, limited air evacuation. 6.5% World War II, European theater, extensive air evacuation. 4.5% World War II, final year, fully integrated air evacuation system. 2.5%. But the raw mortality percentages masked the real revolution. The critical statistic was survival rate from severe wounds, injuries that in previous conflicts were effectively death sentences. Severe abdominal wounds, Civil War survival rate, 13% World War I survival rate, 29% World War II with air evacuation, 78% compound femoral fractures, World War I survival rate, 55% World War II with air evacuation, 97.5% severe chest trauma, World War I survival rate, 35% World War II with air evacuation, 85%. These weren't marginal improvements. These were wholesale rewrites of medical probability. Wounds that killed in 1918 were survivable in 1944, not because surgical techniques had improved that dramatically, though they had improved, but because men reached surgery before shock, infection, and bleeding killed them. The cascade effect air evacuation created what medical historians call a cascade effect, each advantage multiplying the next. Advantage 1, time compression. Ground evacuation, 18 to 36 hours from wound to surgery. Air evacuation, 2 to 6 hours from wound to surgery. This alone saved lives. But it enabled Advantage 2. Advantage 2, treatment. During transport ground evacuation, minimal intervention possible in bouncing ambulances over rough roads, air evacuation, continuous medical monitoring, IV therapy, whole blood transfusions, oxygen administration, medication adjustments, all performed by trained medical professionals during flight, which enabled Advantage 3. Advantage 3. Arrival in treatable condition. Ground evacuation patients often arrived in shock, hypothermic, with infections beginning, requiring emergency stabilization before surgery could even begin. Air evacuation patients arrived stabilized, monitored, with interventions already begun, going directly from aircraft to operating room within minutes, which cascaded into Advantage 4. Advantage 4, surgical success rates. Surgeons operating on recently wounded, stabilized patients had success rates 40 to 60% higher than surgeons operating on patients who'd endured prolonged, traumatic ground transport. Each advantage built on the previous, creating a system where survival rates exceeded anything previously considered possible in military medicine. The invisible advantage, morale. There was another effect, harder to quantify but arguably as important, psychological impact on frontline soldiers. Interviews with combat veterans revealed a consistent pattern. Soldiers who knew air evacuation was available fought differently than soldiers who didn't. Not more recklessly, actually more effectively. The knowledge that being wounded didn't mean a death sentence, that help could arrive within hours rather than days, reduced the paralyzing fear that made men freeze under fire. Lieutenant Colonel Howard Smith, a battalion commander in the 82nd Airborne, noted in his after-action report, "Men advance more aggressively when they trust medical evacuation. The presence of C-47s at forward airstrips provides assurance that translates to tactical advantage. Soldiers who believe they'll receive rapid care take necessary tactical risks. Soldiers who believe they'll bleed out in an aid station become cautious to the point of tactical ineffectiveness." This wasn't recklessness. It was calculated risk-taking based on realistic assessment of survival odds. And it gave Allied forces a combat advantage that extended beyond mere medical statistics. German and Japanese soldiers knew their medical evacuation systems were inferior. This knowledge affected combat behavior. Japanese soldiers in particular, facing the prospect of days-long evacuation from remote Pacific islands, often fought with suicidal desperation, not from cultural factors alone, but from rational understanding that being wounded meant likely death regardless. American soldiers, by contrast, could afford to surrender when survival was impossible, could accept wounds that required evacuation, could maintain discipline even when severely outnumbered, because evacuation meant survival, not a slow death in an overcrowded field hospital. October 1943, Luftwaffe High Command, Berlin. General Oberst Hans Jeschonek studied the intelligence report with increasing concern. American air evacuation operations in North Africa and Sicily were evacuating wounded at rates that seemed impossible. According to Luftwaffe reconnaissance, the Americans were operating dozens of C-47 flights daily, each carrying 20 to 24 wounded soldiers, moving men from frontline airstrips to hospitals in Algeria, Tunisia, and now Sicily within hours. Can we replicate this? Jeschonek asked the medical liaison officer. The officer, a doctor conscripted into administrative service, shook his head. Herr Generaloberst, we lack several critical factors. First, aircraft. Our transport fleet is committed to supplying encircled units, moving troops, and logistical support. Converting transports to medical evacuation would require dedicated aircraft we cannot spare. Second, airstrip infrastructure. The Americans build forward airstrips constantly, rough fields sufficient for C-47 operations within days of securing territory. Our doctrine emphasizes permanent bases with proper runways. We lack their engineering capacity for rapid airfield construction. Third, medical personnel trained for air operations. The Americans train specialized flight nurses. We have no equivalent program. Our nurses are needed in field hospitals. Dedicating them to air transport would deplete field medical capability. Jeschonek absorbed this. So we cannot match their system? No, sir. We can improve our ground evacuation, better ambulances, faster roads, improved field hospitals. But matching their air evacuation would require restructuring our entire medical logistics system, resources we don't have, time we don't have, infrastructure that would take years to build. The officer didn't mention the deepest problem. Germany was losing air superiority. Air evacuation required safe airspace. C-47s were slow, unarmed, vulnerable. They flew because Allied fighters controlled the skies. German transport aircraft, by late 1943, faced Allied fighters that shot them down with impunity. Even if Germany had developed an air evacuation system, they couldn't have protected it. Jeschonek dismissed the officer and returned to the intelligence report. The numbers were damning. American wounded soldiers survived at rates 40% higher than German wounded, not because American surgeons were superior, German military medicine was excellent, but because American wounded reached surgeons while German wounded died slowly on roads, in trains, waiting for transport that couldn't come or came too late. It was an advantage that couldn't be countered. Not with tactics, not with better weapons, not with improved training. The Americans had built a system that rendered conventional medical evacuation obsolete, and Germany couldn't replicate it. The Pacific, Japan's impossible choice. The Japanese military faced even worse constraints. Island geography made air evacuation theoretically ideal, short flights between islands, avoiding the need for road networks. But Japan lacked the industrial capacity to produce dedicated medical transport aircraft while simultaneously maintaining bomber and fighter production. Moreover, American submarine warfare and air superiority made inter-island transport increasingly suicidal. Japanese transport aircraft flew at night, flying low to avoid radar, often without fighter escort. Medical evacuation flights, unarmed, slow, predictable, became easy targets. Statistics from Guadalcanal illustrate the tragedy. Of approximately 31,000 Japanese soldiers deployed to Guadalcanal, roughly 25,000 died, but only 5,000 from combat. The remaining 20,000 died from disease, starvation, and inadequate medical care. Japanese wounded who might have survived with rapid evacuation instead died on beaches, in jungle aid stations, waiting for transport that never materialized. An American soldier wounded on Guadalcanal had better survival odds than a Japanese soldier wounded in the same battle on the same island, often from the same type of weapon. The difference wasn't courage, training, or medical knowledge. It was logistics. It was C-47s landing on Henderson Field, loading wounded, and flying them to hospital ships or rear area hospitals within hours. By 1944, Japanese military medical reports openly acknowledged the disparity. One report from a field hospital commander on New Guinea stated bluntly, "American wounded receive advanced medical care within hours. Our wounded wait days or weeks. This disparity creates survival rate differences approaching 40%. We cannot compete with their air evacuation system. We can only improve efficiency of our inadequate ground transport." It was a brutal admission. We cannot match them. We can only minimize our disadvantage. December 1944. Base Hospital, Prestwick, Scotland. Lieutenant Dorothy Grant sat in the nurses' quarters, unable to sleep despite exhaustion that made her bones ache. She'd flown 2 missions that day, morning run from France, afternoon run from Belgium. 47 wounded men total. 2 had died during flight. She kept seeing their faces. Private Rodriguez, abdominal wound, who'd lasted 90 minutes before his blood pressure crashed, and she couldn't bring it back. Sergeant Thompson, head trauma, who'd been stable at takeoff and seized violently at 8,000 feet, dying before she could even begin intervention. Grant had flown 127 missions. She'd transported 2,147 wounded soldiers. 43 had died during flight despite her efforts. She could remember every single one, faces, names, dog tag numbers, the exact moment when she realized she couldn't save them, the specific details of how they'd died. The official reports called Air Evacuation a triumph. The statistics supported that narrative. 98.5% survival rate for patients who boarded aircraft alive. Extraordinary, unprecedented, revolutionary. But Grant lived in the 1.5%. She lived in the 43 men she couldn't save, the decisions made in seconds that might have been wrong, the faces that visited her when she closed her eyes. The psychological price flight nurses weren't issued Purple Hearts when they broke. There was no official recognition of the psychological trauma inherent in the job. You flew your missions, you saved your patients, you maintained composure, and you didn't complain about nightmares. But the nightmares came anyway. Post-war psychiatric studies, conducted decades later after the stigma of battle fatigue had somewhat diminished, revealed that flight nurses suffered from what we now recognize as PTSD at rates comparable to bomber crews. The symptoms were similar: intrusive memories, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, avoidance of reminders. The causes were specific to their experience. Bomber crews faced enemy fire and the possibility of death. Flight nurses faced something different: the certainty of holding life and death authority over dozens of men, the knowledge that wrong decisions killed people, the crushing responsibility of working alone at 10,000 feet with no backup, no second opinions, no room for error. Captain Louise Miller, flight nurse with 156 missions, described it in a 1946 interview. Every flight was a series of decisions: give morphine or not, start an IV or monitor longer, move to this patient or that patient when both needed attention. Each decision could mean life or death. You carried that weight. It never got lighter. Some nurses broke during service. The washout rate for active flight nurses was approximately 15%, not from physical inability, but from psychological collapse. They simply couldn't handle the pressure anymore. The Army quietly reassigned them to ground hospitals, and the program continued. Those who survived their service carried invisible wounds. Post-war adjustment was difficult for many. The transition from making life or death decisions in crisis conditions to civilian nursing felt simultaneously mundane and overwhelming. Some thrived. Others struggled with depression, anxiety, substance abuse. The Veterans Administration, focused primarily on male combat veterans, provided minimal support for female military personnel. Flight nurses, having served in a relatively small and specialized capacity, were nearly invisible in the post-war narrative. Their contribution was acknowledged in official histories, but rarely understood in its full psychological complexity. The men who flew them. The pilots and crew of medical evacuation flights faced their own pressures. They weren't protected by the Geneva Convention's provisions for medical aircraft. Those provisions applied to clearly marked hospital ships and ground ambulances, but the realities of aerial warfare made protected medical aircraft unrealistic. C-47s flew marked with large red crosses, but enemy fighters didn't always respect those markings, sometimes through confusion, sometimes deliberately. German and Japanese pilots occasionally targeted medical flights, either believing they were carrying military cargo or simply not caring. More commonly, medical C-47s simply happened to be in the wrong airspace when enemy fighters attacked, and the fighters shot at anything that moved. Casualties among air evacuation crews were significant. Between 1942 and 1945, approximately 17 medical evacuation C-47s were shot down or crashed in combat zones, killing crews and patients aboard. Dozens more were damaged by enemy fire, but managed to land safely. The psychological burden was unique. Combat pilots flew missions knowing they might die but could fight back, drop bombs, fire guns, perform evasive maneuvers. Medical evacuation pilots flew unarmed aircraft filled with wounded men who couldn't fight, couldn't evacuate, couldn't even move. If an enemy fighter attacked, the pilot's only options were desperate evasive maneuvers that would throw wounded men against litter restraints and possibly restart bleeding or cause other trauma. Captain James Wilson, pilot with 89 medical evacuation missions, described the fear in a post-war memoir. You're carrying 23 wounded men who trust you to get them to safety. You've got a nurse back there working to keep them alive. You're flying slow and straight because turbulence could kill your patients. And then you see a German fighter at 3 o'clock, and you know if he decides to shoot, there's nothing you can do except watch your patients die. That fear never goes away. Every flight, you're waiting for fighters. Most missions were routine, but the possibility of catastrophe haunted every flight, adding psychological pressure to already stressful work. June 12, 1945. Base Hospital, Fort Dix, New Jersey. Private First Class. James Mitchell stood in front of the mirror examining his reflection with clinical detachment. His left leg ended mid-thigh, the stump wrapped in clean bandages, the prosthetic leg propped against the wall beside him. He was 23 years old. He'd been in the hospital for exactly 1 year and 4 days. He remembered fragments of the evacuation, morphine haze, engine noise, a woman's voice cutting through the pain saying, "Stay with me." He remembered the hospital in Scotland, surgeons working frantically to save what remained of his leg, ultimately deciding amputation was the only option. He remembered the slow recovery, infection, fever, weeks of wondering if he'd die despite surviving the wound. But he was alive, standing, learning to walk with the prosthetic, facing a future that seemed uncertain but possible. He thought about the medic who'd reached him in the hedgerow. Riley, that was the name. Riley had promised 3 hours to surgery. It had actually been 7 hours and 41 minutes, Mitchell had learned later. But compared to what that timeline would have been in any previous war, 7 hours and 41 minutes was a miracle. Mitchell had done the research during his recovery. In World War I, his wound would have killed him. Not immediately, slowly over hours or days, from shock, blood loss, infection. The medical science existed to save him, but he would have died waiting for help that came too slowly. In World War II, with air evacuation, he'd survived. The C-47 that had carried him from France to Scotland, the flight nurse who'd administered whole blood at 9,000 feet, the system that had compressed a 3-day journey into 3 hours, all of it had combined to keep him alive. He'd lost his leg, but he was alive to lose it, alive to grieve it, alive to adapt, alive to return home and build whatever life he could build. That was the revolution, Mitchell understood now. Not that war was less deadly. War remained catastrophically destructive. But that the boundary between survivable and fatal wounds had shifted dramatically. Injuries that killed in 1918 could be survived in 1944 if you reached help quickly enough. Mitchell strapped on his prosthetic leg and took 3 careful steps across the room. The physical therapist had told him he'd walk without crutches within 3 months. He'd be discharged within 6. He'd go home to Illinois, to his family, to a life that would be different from what he'd planned, but was still a life worth living. Outside the window, he could hear aircraft engines, transports landing at the base airfield, bringing more wounded soldiers home from the Pacific and Europe. The war in Europe had ended. Japan was collapsing. The system that had saved him was now processing the final waves of casualties, sending them home, returning them to lives that were damaged but not destroyed. The arithmetic of salvation. The final statistics of air evacuation compiled by the Army Medical Department after the war documented an achievement unprecedented in military history. Total patients evacuated by air, 1,776,148. Total flights, 41,582. Total air miles flown, 4,563,847. Patients who died in flight, 1,760, 0.15%. Estimated additional lives saved by rapid evacuation, between 100,000 and 200,000. That last statistic was necessarily speculative, calculated by comparing survival rates from similar wounds in World War I against World War II survival rates, controlling for advances in antibiotics and surgical technique. The consensus among military medical historians was that air evacuation, independent of other medical advances, increased survival probability for severely wounded soldiers by approximately 35 to 45%. Applied to the total number of severely wounded American soldiers, approximately 350,000, this suggests air evacuation prevented between 120,000 and 160,000 deaths that would have occurred under World War I evacuation conditions. 120,000 to 160,000 lives. Fathers who came home to their children. Sons who returned to their parents. Husbands who rebuilt lives with their wives. Men who became teachers, engineers, shopkeepers, artists, who raised families and built communities and lived full lives because a C-47 had carried them from a battlefield to a hospital before shock and blood loss killed them. This was the quiet revolution, not dramatic, not celebrated in films or memorials, just logistics, organization, medical innovation, and relentless systematic efficiency applied to the problem of death and distance. The legacy. The air evacuation system developed during World War II became the template for all subsequent military medical evacuation. Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan all relied on helicopter and fixed-wing evacuation systems that were evolutionary descendants of the C-47 medical flights. The principle remained constant. Compress time between injury and treatment, provide medical care during transport, get the wounded to definitive medical care before shock, blood loss, and infection become irreversible. Modern military medicine speaks of the golden hour, the critical 60 minutes after severe trauma when aggressive intervention offers maximum survival benefit. World War II air evacuation didn't coin the phrase, but it proved the concept. Men who reached surgery within hours had survival rates that men who reached surgery within days could never match. The flight nurses, many of whom never spoke publicly about their service, became a historical footnote, remembered vaguely as women who flew, their actual contribution reduced to symbolic angel of mercy narratives that sanitized the brutal reality of their work. Dorothy Grant returned to Chicago after the war, worked as a civilian nurse for 37 years. Married, raised 2 children, and died in 1987 at age 69. Her obituary mentioned she'd been a military nurse but didn't detail her 127 missions or the 2,804 men she'd helped save. 43 of her patients had died. The remaining 2,804 had survived. Her children learned about her war service primarily from the small box of medals and commendations she'd kept in the attic, rarely mentioning them during her lifetime. She represented thousands of medical personnel, nurses, technicians, pilots, crew chiefs, who had built and operated a system that saved more lives than most battlefield victories. They received relatively little recognition, partly because medical logistics lacks the drama of combat, partly because their success was measured in lives not lost rather than victories achieved. But the men who survived, like James Mitchell, never forgot. They carried memories of cargo bays and engine noise, of nurses working in impossible conditions, of flights that transformed death sentences into survivable wounds. They went home, built lives, raised families, and occasionally in quiet moments reflected on the fact that they existed because someone had figured out how to put hospitals in the sky. August 14, 1945. Airfield, Okinawa. The last medical evacuation flight of World War II departed Okinawa at 14:20 hours, destination Manila, Philippines. C-47 number 4349507 carried 18 wounded soldiers, casualties from the final weeks of the Okinawa campaign, men who'd been hit by Japanese artillery, snipers, and suicide attackers in the brutal house-to-house fighting that characterized the battle's end. Major Patricia Donnelly, flight nurse with 143 missions, worked her way down the litter rows, checking each man with practiced efficiency. She'd been doing this for 22 months. The procedures were automatic now. Check bandages, monitor breathing, assess color, evaluate pain levels, make rapid decisions about intervention. She didn't know this was the last flight. No one did. The war with Japan continued. Rumors of some kind of new weapon being used, of Japanese surrender negotiations, circulated constantly, but combat operations continued. Wounded men kept coming. Flights kept flying. But history would record that this flight, departing Okinawa at 14:20 hours on August 14, 1945, was the final medical evacuation mission of the war. Japan would announce surrender within hours. Combat operations would cease. The system that had carried more than 1 million wounded soldiers would stand down, its mission complete. Donnelly didn't know any of this. She just worked, moving from litter to litter, doing what she'd done 143 times before, keeping men alive until they reached the hospital in Manila. Litter 3A, Corporal Robert Chen, shrapnel wounds to back and legs, stable, morphine administered 30 minutes ago. Good color, breathing regular. Litter 3B, Private William Morrison, compound fracture of left arm, some bleeding through the cast, but not excessive. Conscious, speaking coherently, asking about his unit. Litter 4A, Private First Class Thomas Jefferson, severe burns to face and hands from a flamethrower accident. This one worried her. Burns were unpredictable. Infection could set in rapidly. But his vital signs were acceptable, and they'd be in Manila in 90 minutes. The burn unit there could handle him. She finished her initial assessment and settled into the small workspace at the forward bulkhead, her medical log open, documenting each patient's status. The C-47's engines droned steadily. Sunlight streamed through the small windows, painting diagonal stripes across the litter rows. 18 men. Most would survive. The odds were overwhelming at this point. Air evacuation had pushed survival rates so high that losing a patient during flight had become unusual rather than expected. These men would reach Manila, receive surgery and treatment, gradually heal, and eventually go home. Home. Donnelly thought about that sometimes during flights. These men were going home, even if that journey took months. She would go home too, eventually, back to Oregon, back to a life that seemed increasingly distant and unreal. How did you return to normalcy after flying 143 missions, after making thousands of life or death decisions, after carrying the weight of so many lives? She didn't know. She'd figure it out when the time came. For now, she had 18 wounded men to monitor, 90 minutes of flight time ahead, and procedures to follow. That was enough. That had always been enough. The C-47 flew south toward Manila, carrying its final cargo of wounded soldiers toward healing. Below, the Pacific stretched blue and endless, hiding the wreckage of the war, sunken ships, crashed aircraft, the bodies of men who hadn't been lucky enough to reach the flying hospitals that had saved so many others. In hospitals across the Pacific, Europe, North Africa, and the continental United States, men recovered from wounds that would have killed them in any previous war. Some would heal completely. Others would carry physical and psychological scars forever. But they would live. They would go home. They would build lives. That was the revolution's final accounting. Not victories or defeats. Not territory conquered or enemies destroyed. But lives preserved. Men who should have died who lived instead. Fathers, sons, brothers, husbands returned to families who would never fully understand what had been required to bring them home. The system that accomplished this, the aircraft, the procedures, the training, the logistics, the dedication of medical personnel, would be studied, refined, and replicated by every military in the world. The principles of rapid evacuation and continuous medical care would become foundational to modern emergency medicine, influencing civilian trauma care, ambulance services, and emergency medical protocols. But in August 1945, aboard C-47 number 4349507, Major Patricia Donnelly didn't think about legacy or historical significance. She checked her watch, 60 minutes to Manila, and moved down the aisle to check on Corporal Chen's bandage, which looked like it might need changing before landing. The work continued as it always had, one patient at a time, one decision at a time, one life at a time, until the wheels touched down in Manila and the cargo door opened, and 18 more wounded soldiers were carried toward recovery, adding their names to the list of more than 1 million men who'd flown through the war's skies and survived because someone had figured out how to conquer distance and time, transforming flying cargo haulers into machines of salvation. 1985. Veterans Hospital, Los Angeles, California. James Mitchell was 63 years old. He'd lived 41 years since the morning a German shell fragment had torn through his thigh in a Norman hedgerow. He'd walked on a prosthetic leg for 40 of those years. He'd married, raised 3 children, worked as an accountant, coached Little League, voted in elections, paid taxes, argued with neighbors about property lines, and lived a completely ordinary life, made extraordinary only by the fact that he existed at all. He sat in the hospital waiting room, a routine checkup for his stump, which sometimes developed pain after 4 decades of prosthetic use, and noticed an elderly woman across the room wearing a small pin on her cardigan. He recognized it, Flight Nurse Wings, the small insignia given to the 500 women who'd qualified for that specialized service. Mitchell stood, crossed the waiting room, and sat beside her. "Excuse me, ma'am, were you a flight nurse?" She looked at him, eyes sharp despite her age. "I was. 127 missions, European theater. You?" "I was cargo, June 1944, Normandy to Scotland. Lost my leg, but kept my life." She smiled, a small, knowing smile that acknowledged everything that didn't need to be said. "I'm glad you made it. I'm glad you flew." They sat quietly for a moment. Around them, the hospital waiting room hummed with mundane activity. People reading magazines, children fidgeting, a television playing a game show no one watched. "Do you ever think about the numbers?" Mitchell asked. "How many men would have died if that system hadn't existed?" She considered. "The official estimate was 100,000 to 200,000 additional lives saved. I think about that sometimes. Think about all the families, the children born, the lives built, all because of logistics and organization and C-47s. Think about what would have been lost if those men had died," Mitchell said. "Teachers who never taught, scientists who never researched, artists who never created, fathers who never raised children. All those contributions to the world that never happened because similar men died in previous wars." The woman nodded. "And the reverse. All the contributions that did happen because men survived. Every teacher who taught because he lived, every child raised, every business built, every idea shared, cascading effects across decades." Mitchell thought about his own children, 3 lives that wouldn't have existed if he'd bled out in Normandy. His grandchildren, 7 of them now. All the descendants who would never exist in parallel timelines where air evacuation hadn't been invented, where he died in a field hospital from shock and blood loss. Multiply that across 150,000 men. How many children never born in those alternate histories? How many businesses never started, inventions never created, books never written, songs never sung? The mathematics of mercy extended beyond simple life and death. It rippled forward through generations, through cascading consequences impossible to fully calculate. They should have built monuments, Mitchell said, not to generals or battles, but to the system itself, to the logistics officers who planned it, the engineers who built the airfields, the pilots who flew, the nurses who worked. They saved more lives than most combat victories. They didn't build monuments, the woman replied. They wrote manuals. The system we built became the template for every military medical evacuation since. Korea, Vietnam, all the wars after. Helicopters instead of C-47s, but the same principle. Get the wounded to definitive care before they die from time and distance. That's the monument, Mitchell said. Every soldier evacuated by helicopter in Vietnam, every Marine flown to safety in Iraq, they're the monument, living proof that the system works, that the revolution continues. A nurse called the woman's name. She stood, gathered her purse, and looked down at Mitchell. What was your nurse's name? The one on your flight? Mitchell had to think. He'd been in and out of consciousness, drugged on morphine, but he remembered the name tag on her uniform, glimpsed during a moment of clarity. Grant, Lieutenant Grant. Dorothy Grant, the woman said. I knew her, good nurse. She saved a lot of men. She saved me. She saved all of you. That was her job. The woman walked toward the examination rooms, her flight nurse wings glinting under the fluorescent lights, carrying her own memories of cargo bays and wounded men and decisions made at 10,000 feet. Mitchell watched her go, then returned to his seat. His appointment wasn't for another 20 minutes. He picked up a magazine, but didn't read it. Instead, he thought about alternate histories, about the life he'd lived versus the death he should have died, about systems and revolutions and the quiet heroism of logistics. Outside, Los Angeles traffic hummed. Airplanes passed overhead, leaving contrails against the blue California sky. The world spun on, populated by millions of people who existed because of decisions made decades earlier, because someone had figured out how to put hospitals in the sky, because nurses had flown into danger, because a system had been built that prioritized saving lives over every other consideration. The revolution hadn't been televised, hadn't been dramatic, hadn't been celebrated with parades. It had been built from C-47s and litter racks and medical protocols, from the dedication of 500 flight nurses and thousands of pilots and crew members, from systematic planning and relentless execution. But it had worked. By God, it had worked. And 41 years later, James Mitchell sat in a hospital waiting room with a prosthetic leg and a life he'd never expected to live, living proof that sometimes the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields, but in cargo holds at 10,000 feet, one patient at a time, one life at a time, one miracle of organization and dedication at a time. The nurse called his name. Mitchell stood, adjusted his prosthetic, and walked toward the examination room, carrying his life forward into a future that shouldn't have existed, but did.